During World War II, the number of weapons and vehicles used far exceeded any previous or subsequent records of conflict. Millions of machines and equipment of all types were employed. After the surrender of the Axis forces, there was a pressing question on the minds of the victors. What to do with all these resources? Many were reclaimed by the winning sides, while others were left to fate. This material was studied to aid in the technological development of its new owners. Unfortunately, much of it was used again for killing. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about what happened to Nazi weapons after World War II. On May 8, 1945, after nearly 6 years of bloody battles, Germany signed its unconditional surrender to the Western Allies and the Soviets. The war in Europe had come to an end. The country's government lay in ruins, its policies imposed by the victors. Its territory was divided into two: the Federal Republic, controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom and their allies, and the Democratic Republic under communist influence. But these powers were not only vying for territory, they also sought control over Germany's military resources. Thanks to its advanced weaponry, among other factors, the Reich had dominated the early years of the war. Now all those weapons and vehicles were in the hands of the victors. Decisions had to be made about how to distribute them. Leaving them under German control was not an option. Every effort was made to prevent their use in future conflicts, at least not against the victorious countries. Many German civilians had obtained pistols or rifles left behind and were reluctant to return them. They felt these weapons might be necessary in the turbulent post-war situation in the country. Nevertheless, a significant and detailed effort was made to disarm the population and what remained of the armed forces. Both Western and Soviet powers sought to study German weapons to gain an advantage over each other. It was clear to everyone that a new conflict was looming between these two blocs. One could say that the Cold War began as soon as World War II ended. Negotiations were attempted initially to agree on the distribution of these materials among the victors. Distribution was supposed to be based on contributions during the conflict. Due to massive mobilization of men and equipment, losses suffered, and being the first to reach Berlin, the Soviet Union demanded a significant portion. Overall, there were not many protests from Western powers, as they also had substantial gains. United States and the United Kingdom, primarily besides seizing a large quantity of weapons and vehicles, also provided refuge to numerous Nazi scientists. They were offered exemption from the Nuremberg trials, where their compatriots were being judged, in exchange for collaborating on research projects for the Allies. This plan was known as Operation Paperclip and focused mainly on achieving technological advancements in rockets and chemical weapons, areas where the Germans had made significant progress. Between 1,500 and 2,000 scientists, engineers, and technicians were secretly transported to the United States to assist in fields such as aeronautics, rocketry, engineering, among others. We can hear a writer discussing this operation.
Thank you.
So these were top scientists in the German war effort, sought out by the U.S. military as the war was coming to an end.
That's right. These were Hitler's top weapons makers, and Operation Paperclip became a classified military program to bring them to the United States. It also had a public face, so there was, on the one hand, the truth about the program kept secret, and on the other hand, the idea that we'll tell the public that these are the good Germans.
The Western strategy of focusing on obtaining technological knowledge from former Nazi scientists contrasted with the Soviet plan. The Soviets largely appropriated German weaponry and incorporated it into their own ranks. Thousands of tanks, planes, and rifles became part of the Red Army or the forces of their communist allies. Nevertheless, resources were also allocated to unravel the scientific advancements achieved by the Germans. This was done through their own operation, named WWII, where German technical personnel living in areas occupied by the Soviets were brought into Soviet territory. For instance, thanks to these men and recovered Messerschmitt Me-262 planes, the Soviets created their first turbojet fighter, designated the MiG-9. This vehicle was used extensively by the Eastern Giant and also sold to their allies for use in numerous conflicts. Another case was the study of V-2 missiles, the world's first long-range ballistic missiles. Analyzing these was crucial for the Soviets to later launch the Sputnik satellite, for example. Scientists appropriated by Paperclip also assisted in the development of the American space program. One such figure was Wernher von Braun, who became a member of NASA and played a vital role in achieving the moon landing. Because of these contributions, it can be argued that Nazi researchers were crucial in the space race between the two powers that occurred from the 1960s onwards. There was another field where this German personnel helped advance. The Americans had dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japanese territory in August 1945. To remain competitive, the Soviets needed to develop their own weapons of mass destruction. The Germans had begun planning the design of these devices, but had not achieved a usable model before the Reich's surrender. Now, however, captured or incorporated scientists in the Soviet Union were put to work to continue developing this weaponry. The Russians made significant strides in this area, and with the help of new personnel, achieved their first successful test in 1949. Thus, they became the second nuclear power, behind their American rival, thanks in part to the contribution of Nazi research. The industrial use of nuclear energy stemmed from this military branch. Starting from the 1950s, substantial resources were employed to generate electricity from this source. In 1954, the Soviets built the first functional nuclear power plant in the city of Obninsk. Western powers also followed suit, and in the subsequent years, the first of these facilities were inaugurated in England, the United States, and other countries. Submarine warfare was another military aspect, where the Germans were far more advanced than their rivals. The Type WWII submarines, the latest model created by the Germans, barely saw combat as they entered service only in the war's final months. However, by the war's end, these vessels were captured and incorporated into the fleets of the victors. They featured a design that achieved longer submersion times, underwater speed, rapid torpedo loading, and crew comfort, making them highly valuable to American and European powers. Drawing primarily from this model, countries such as the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and Sweden would launch a new generation of submarines. Apart from armament development, there was a darker aspect to leveraging German scientific achievements. During the war, Nazi doctors conducted inhumane experiments on prisoners held in concentration camps. These experiments primarily involved exposing men and women to chemical weapons, harmful or lethal pathogens, and brutal conditions like hypothermia. In many cases, those subjected to these trials were subsequently killed. The experiments had no moral or ethical basis and were vehemently condemned upon discovery. Nonetheless, the results obtained were used to expand medical knowledge, such as understanding the effects of chemicals used in combat. To this day, controversy persists over whether it is ethical to use information from these experiments, as we can hear in the following news report from the United States.
Documents obtained by 12 News show the Arizona Department of Corrections is taking steps to restart its gas chamber for the first time in more than 2 decades. The state will use chemicals similar to the deadly mix that killed millions in Nazi death camps.
How can you think that that's reasonable? Did anybody who is associated with this process ever study the Holocaust?
In summary, both sides, the Allies and the Communists, developed their military technology based on or aided by German innovations. That's why, in conflicts during the following decades, political allies of these powers would face each other using weapons and vehicles derived from the same research. This was evident, for example, in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Nazi-captured equipment was supplied to governments fighting during these Cold War decades. In many communist and anti-communist movements of these years, factions fought with weapons like the MG-42 machine gun or the STG-44 rifle, both of German origin. The latter greatly influenced the design of the AK-47, the most widely used rifle worldwide. However, there were also many military resources that would not be utilized by any party. For instance, the cost of transporting vehicles from Europe, where they had seen combat, to the United States was significant. If tanks or planes were of inferior quality compared to American ones, or studying them would yield no technological advancement, it was easier to simply dump them in the ocean. This prevented them from falling into enemy hands. This disposal was not limited to German equipment, but extended to their own as well. This occurred in nearly all theaters of operations, conducted by most of the Allies, but primarily by the United States. On the island of Espiritu Santo in the Vanuatu archipelago, there's a place called $1 Million Point. It earned its name from the value of everything the Americans dumped there. In general, this included vehicles such as trucks, cranes, and even tanks, as described in the following video.
At the conclusion of World War II, the Americans made the decision to leave all their equipment here on Santo, and that included bulldozers, trucks, graders, jeeps. Everything that was used here on the island in one way or another was going to be left here on Santo. The equipment was offered to the French, who were the government of the day here on Santo, and the Americans offered it to them at 6 cents in the dollar. But the French thought they could outwit the Americans and wait until they'd left, and then they could get all the equipment for free. Once the Americans got wind of what the French were up to, they decided that if the French didn't pay for that equipment, no one was going to have it. So for 2 solid days, they brought everything they could get down here to this spot and bulldozed everything into the sea. And just to make sure no one had access to it, they blew up the jetty. This is where this area gets its name, $1 Million Point.
Much of the captured German ships met the same fate and were sunk to the bottom of the sea. However, at times they were given a final use. Many of these ships were employed in tests of new weaponry developed by the Allies, often involving nuclear bombs. World powers had a keen interest in assessing how these weapons of mass destruction affected ships within their impact zones. Countless tons of equipment, ranging from small caliber weapons to vehicles and chemical arsenal like mustard gas, were dumped into the sea. Nearly all of this equipment remains there, slowly rusting away, despite the ecological and environmental hazards they pose. Of course, there were other endings for much of these resources. Starting from 1944, it became common for the Nazis to bury armaments in European soil, in secret caches. This was planned under Operation Werewolf. The idea was that as the Allies and Soviets advanced on German or conquered territory, a resistance force would operate behind enemy lines. They would unearth these weapons caches and launch surprise attacks on the invaders. This would sow disorder in their ranks and halt or slow their advance. Additionally, it was expected that after a potential German surrender, this force would continue resisting foreign occupation. While these Werewolf commandos carried out some sabotage and assassination actions, the movement was always plagued by disorganization and poor leadership. There are no verified records of operations carried out after the war ended. The reality is that they never posed a real threat to their enemies, and the plan was quickly abandoned. Nevertheless, both Allies and Soviets were aware of these caches and invested resources in finding them. Many were unearthed and their weapons confiscated, but others remain undiscovered. Even today, sometimes by chance, someone comes across a cache full of Nazi equipment. Often, treasure hunters intentionally seek out these time capsules to donate them or add them to their personal collections. The clay in which they were preserved and the low humidity of their environment often means they are found in perfect condition, as if the war ended yesterday. Below, we can see the type of objects found by these individuals. Another large portion of resources, both from the Axis and the Allies, was neither buried nor sunk but remained in inaccessible places. This was mostly the case in desert theaters of operations, such as in Libya or the Sahara. Here, hundreds of vehicles like airplanes and tanks are currently found in locations known as war cemeteries. The warm climate and lack of humidity have preserved them in relatively good condition, even decades later. Something similar occurred on the Eastern European front. During the rainy seasons in the Russian steppes, the terrain became so muddy that soldiers were sometimes forced to abandon their vehicles. Tanks, trucks, and other armored vehicles became unusable under the mud. After the war ended, in most cases, this equipment was not recovered due to the same cost reasons discussed earlier. Therefore, to this day, they remain immobile in the swamps of the former Soviet Union. In countries that were part of this government, there are currently tank hunters who make a living by recovering and selling parts of these ancient machines. Another use for captured Nazi equipment was to supplement a portion of the raw materials lost during the war. This occurred mainly in the Soviet republics, whose industrial power suffered a severe blow during the conflict years. These weapons and vehicles were a good source of metal, so many of them were melted down and used for manufacturing in other sectors, or even within the military. Finally, pieces of weaponry were sold or donated to museums where they are exhibited to this day. There are a large number of these museums, both in Western and Soviet countries, showcasing weapons, vehicles, clothing, and other types of equipment. In Germany and Italy, it is also common to find these scenes recreated, depicting how combat might have looked during some of the battles of World War II. All of these museums aim to educate and raise awareness among the population about one of the bloodiest conflicts in modern history. Below, we see an example of these museums.
Okay, over here I have a small machine gun bunker. Okay, it's got the K98s, the MP40, the Lugers, the P38, the MG42, the MG34, and Hitler was way ahead of everybody. This is the fastest shooting machine gun in World War II. See those 8mm bullets? They're dated 1938. Let me show you. 1938, if you could zoom in. That machine gun shoots a rate of 12 to 1,300 bullets a minute.
Throughout this episode, we've seen that weaponry, both Nazi and Allied, had numerous fates. Some were destroyed, others saw combat again in different conflicts, while many were used to advance the military industry of the victors. Despite the ethical concerns that using German research or equipment could entail, all countries utilize them to gain a better position in future conflicts. We've reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, do you think it was right to use Nazi scientists to develop the military power of the victors? We look forward to your response in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that have left their mark on history.